class, I wanted to take a few minutes and review Chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby for our flipped classroom. So in Chapter 1, there's a quote in the very beginning of the text where Nick says that his father told him, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. And this we look at as kind of like Nick's yearbook quote, so to speak. This is something that he feels is important to his identity. So what he's supposed to be telling us here is that as the narrator, he's trying not to judge people because other people might not have had the advantages that he's had in his life. Then on the next page, we learn a little bit more about him as well, because on page 1, he tells us that he was always privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men, which means people tend to confide in him. And on page 2, he tells us that he decides to tell this story because of the fact that he met this man named Gatsby. He says on page 2 that only Gatsby, the man who gives this name to this book, was exempt from my reaction, his reaction being disgust. Gatsby, who initially represented everything for which I have an ineffective scorn. He says that Gatsby had this extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and it is not likely I shall ever find again. So he was so impressed by Gatsby that he decided to tell this story. And then he tells us, kind of ominously, that Gatsby turned out all right at the end, but it is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So he kind of became a recluse because of something that he learned from being Gatsby's friend. The other character I wanted to talk about today that we learn about in Chapter 1 is Tom. So we learn that Tom and Nick both went to Yale together, and Tom played football there. And Daisy thinks he's a hulking brute of a man, and Tom is described as having a cruel body, and that's an interesting description. It's because he's such an athlete, and at least he used to be when he went to New Haven. And Nick describes him as a hulking man as well, with big muscles. And then we learn in Chapter 1 that on pages 14 and 15 that Tom, quote, has got some woman in New York. So even though Daisy and Tom seem to be a happily married couple, that's not the case at all. On page 14 and 15, Miss Baker says, Tom's got some woman in New York. Nick says, got some woman? Miss Baker says, she might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? And the telephoning of Tom's woman from New York to call Tom during dinner time is something that came up with Daisy. On page 13, we learn a little bit more about Daisy. On page 13, when the phone rings during dinner, Daisy turns to Nick and she says, I'll tell you a family secret. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? And Nick says, that's why I came over tonight. And then Daisy goes on to say, well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York, blah, blah, blah. And she goes on, and Jordan even chimes in. And then things just get dropped. The conversation seems to not be important after a while. And then Daisy turns to Nick on page 14 and says, I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he? An absolute rose? So Nick gets confused and he says, this was untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly, she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. So she first wants to talk about the butler's nose, and then she calls Nick a rose, but then suddenly she throws her napkin down and basically throws a fit. So we learn that actually Daisy is not really interested in telling Nick these ridiculous stories or giving him compliments. The reason why she's saying these things is because she's trying to distract Nick from listening in on the conversation that Tom's having with this other woman. She doesn't want him to know. But she reveals to him on pages 16 and 17 that she's, quote, so sophisticated. She says, I'm so sophisticated, God, I'm so sophisticated, on page 17. And this is after she tells Nick that when her daughter was born, she says, all right, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. The best thing a girl can be in this world is a beautiful little fool. So you can see she's resentful of the fact that she's not a fool, and she understands what's happening around her. She almost wishes she was just oblivious to everything, because if she was, then she wouldn't feel the pain. So we'll talk more about that when we look at Chapter 2. The other character I wanted to mention is just Jordan, because she's kind of a surface character right now. We don't know a whole lot about her, but we do know one thing. We know that she grew up with Daisy when she and Daisy were young girls in Louisville, and they passed their quote-unquote white girlhood together. So this gives us some background information. It explains why Jordan and Daisy are still friends now, because they've been friends for a long time. And Daisy will be certainly interested in Nick getting to know Jordan as we go forward. And you'll learn a little bit more about Jordan's life as well. Finally, the chapter ends with a little strange observation that Nick makes about someone. At the last pages of the chapter, he notices Gatsby standing on the edge of the dock. And Nick wants to call out to him, but he doesn't, because he says, I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished. So he didn't speak to Gatsby because he almost felt like Gatsby needed to be alone and wanted to be alone in that moment. So that's an interesting thing. Our first appearance of Gatsby is when he's making this strange gesture towards the green light. And we're going to talk about that when we get into chapter 2. Please email me with any questions. Thanks.